Activities is one of the main entities in our application, but so far we store all activities in a simple array called activities, which is declared inside of our root component. And every item in this array represents name of the activity. But soon we're going to need more information which will describe a particular activity. So we gotta represent every activity as an object with a couple of properties. And in this lesson we're going to change activity representation. So our array of activities will be array of objects. Let's go to app component, where currently that activities array is stored. So instead of hard-coding activities array in here, let's just use custom function with the name generateActivities, which is going to dynamically generate array of activities for us. And then let's go ahead and declare this function in our functions.js file. So in here, let's export new function with the name generateActivities. And its job will be to return array of activity objects. So for now, we're going to describe every activity by using three fields: ID, name, and seconds to complete. To generate random unique IDs for every activity, we're going to use another function with the name ID, which we'll declare soon. The next field will be name to store activity name. And finally, property seconds to complete is going to store amount of seconds we have chosen to spend on a particular activity in order to complete it. And then let's go ahead and copy this object and add a couple more activities in this array. So for the second activity, we're going to specify that we wish to spend on this activity 3600 seconds, which means 1 hour. And this activity we'll call training. And finally, for the third activity, we'll specify 2 hours for seconds to complete property. And this activity will be called reading. But to make it easier for us to see how many hours exactly we would like to spend on a particular activity, let's just rewrite values for seconds to complete properties in a little bit different form. We're gonna multiply amount of hours on amount of seconds in 1 hour. So basically in here we're converting hours into seconds. So for the first activity we will not specify any hours at all, so let's use 0. For the second activity let's use 1 hour. And finally for the last activity we're gonna use 2 hours. And this way, by multiplying every hour by 3600 seconds, we are converting hours into seconds. And also, just to avoid repeating ourselves, let's create separate constant which is going to represent amount of seconds in 1 hour. So in our constants.js module, let's create new constant with name seconds in hour. Every hour has 3600 seconds. And finally, let's use our new constant and replace this value. Let's do this in all three objects. So this new constant should also be imported from constants file. Let's write down this import in here. And just to make it more readable, let's place every constant on its own line. And since we have used custom function ID to generate random unique ID for every activity, we're gonna need to define this function. So right here, let's create another function with a name ID. And here I'm just going to write some code, which is going to let us generate random IDs. And in our case, these IDs will be represented by strings. So to generate these IDs, we will use current date converted to string. And then we're gonna append to this string another random number, also converted to string. And let's also trim first two characters out of this string by using native method called substring. So after doing all that, we have to go back to our app component and import our newly created function generateActivities. And then let's take a look what is happening to activities after we generate them by using generateActivities function. So after array of activities is generated, we're gonna make it reactive array and save into activities constant. And then down here in our template, we're gonna pass this activities array into the activities component as activities prop. Inside of this component, we're going to iterate over every activity object from activities array and create activity item component where we're gonna pass individual activity object as another prop called activity. And finally, if we take a look inside of activity item component, we're gonna see that in here, we are just outputting name of the activity. But since we have changed representation of every activity, before it was a string, but now it's an object of this form, where name is stored under name property. So now in order to print activity name, we have to reference name property. And also inside of the activities component, where we were assigning value to key attribute. Before we were assigning activity name, but now since every activity has its own unique identifier, we're gonna use this identifier as a value for key attribute. Usually it is considered a good practice to use resource identifiers as values for key attributes when using Vue directive. And now there is one more function that we have to correct. Let's go back to functions.js. Here at the very end we have a function which generates options for activity select box. So right now into this closure, instead of activity name, will be passed the whole activity object. Let's call it activity. And then as a value for a label property, we're going to reference activity name, like so. And as for value property, let's just use activity identifier .id. And then in the browser, let's try to create new activity and see if new activity item will appear in the list. As we can see, it was added, but the name is empty. So let's figure out what is going on. Inside of our root component app.vue, there is a function which is called whenever we send activity creation form, called createActivity. It receives new activity name that we need to add, but since right now every activity is represented as an object instead of a string, we're gonna have to accept activity name, and instead of pushing the string to the end of activities array, we're gonna push an object. In our case, every activity object is represented by 3 properties, ID, name, and seconds to complete. So we need to create new activity object, assign unique ID by using our ID function. The name for this activity will be received in the parameter from the activity creation form. And finally, as a default value for seconds to complete property, we're gonna use 0. And then before checking it in the browser, we also have to import ID function from functions module. So after that, let's check result in the browser. As we can see, inside of Vue DevTools, activities array contains objects with 3 properties, ID, name, and seconds to complete. And whenever I'm gonna add new activity to the list, we're gonna see that the new object was just added to the end of activities array. So after doing all this refactoring, our activity creation form works as expected. And of course, if we're going to remove all activities, we're gonna end up with an empty activities array in the root component. So far, this part of our application works as expected. Let's continue development in the next lesson.